Rollo, also known as Rollo of Normandy, is believed to have been born sometime in the middle of the 9th century, most likely in the year 860 AD, according to historical chronicles. Rollo will also be known as Rollo of Normandy. After establishing Normandy and becoming its first king, he was a Viking from Scandinavia who eventually built Normandy. In addition to that, he was the founder of Normandy. Two of the other names that have been used to refer to Rollo in literature are Rolf Ru Roland, French, and Hofer, Old Norse. Both of these names are from the French language. Rognvald Einsteinsen, who was believed to have been the Jarl or Earl of Moera, a county located in the northern part of Norway at the beginning of Western Norway, could have been Rollo's father. This is a hypothesis that has been brought forward. In addition to being known by the names Rognvald the Wise and Rognvald the Powerful, he was a close friend and ally of Harald Fairhair, the first known monarch of Norway. He was also known as Rognvald the Powerful. Rognvald was also referred to by the name Rognvald the Powerful at one point in time. On the other hand, the information that is known concerning Rognvald's life is inconsistent, and the narratives that have been published are frequently twisted and exaggerated. There is a common problem in the sources that involves contradictions in the identification of Rollo's father. This problem has to be addressed. In accordance with certain historical documents, Rollo's father could have been Ketil, and it is possible that Ketil Flatnose was the king of the Isles, which was a Norse monarchy located in the Scottish Isles. King of the Isles Ketil Flatnose was an important figure in the realm. However, this information is not in agreement with other documents, as there are accusations that that Rollo's father was actually Rognvald Einsteinsen. This information is not compatible with other papers. However, the extent to which she played a role in Rollo's life is a matter of controversy, and there is exceedingly little data that is publicly available. It is generally recognized that Rollo's mother was a Scandinavian noblewoman by the name of Hilda Horolfsdottir. However, there is very little evidence that is freely available. There are a number of literary chronicles that make reference to the quarrel that took place between Rollo's family and King Harald Fairhair of Norway. Rollo's father and younger brother were both murdered during this combat, and Rollo was driven into exile when his mother, Hildur, petitioned for her son to be granted amnesty. Rollo's father was also considered a victim of this fight. As a consequence of this, Rollo was bound to depart from the country. Rollo is believed to have fled Norway, or possibly Denmark, and then travelled the North Sea, possibly stopping at Orkney. This is the theory that has been put out. We are under the impression that Rollo has fled into exile. On the other hand, the information that is accessible concerning Rollo's early life is unclear, and there are very few specifics. Authors who wrote about Rollo frequently lived many years after his death, and their stories were frequently crafted to support the Norman dynasty that Rollo formed, rather than to depict events as they actually occurred. Authors who wrote about Rollo frequently lived many years after his death. In their efforts to acquire a more profound understanding of Rollo and the point at which he began, the students of history are presented with a tremendous deal of difficulties and conflict. One of the difficulties that historians face when attempting to comprehend Rollo is the question of where in Scandinavia Rollo originated. This is just one of the many paradoxes that historical researchers face. As chroniclers from various eras and places present contradicting stories of Rollo's birthplace and genealogy, the effort to unravel the roots of Rollo, the legendary founder of Normandy, is riddled with complexity and contradictions. Rollo is considered to be the founder of Normandy. There are historians who believe that Rollo was originally from Denmark, such as Du de Saint-Quentin, William of Jumièges, and Orderic Vitalis. On the other hand, there are historians who believe that Rollo was originally from Norway, such as Geoffrey Malaterra and William of Malmesbury. The myth of Hrolf the Walker, as depicted by Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson, adds to the mystery. According to Sturluson, Rollo was born in Moray, Norway, in the late 9th century. His parents were Jarl Rognvald Einsteinsson and noblewoman Hildur Hofstadr. Legend has it that Hrolf's enormous stature earned him the nickname the Walker, because no horse could carry his weight, which meant that he had to travel on foot. On the other hand, these assertions surfaced a significant amount of time after Rollo's death, which raises questions about their veracity and historical significance. Modern examinations, such as a DNA analysis that was conducted in 2016 and examined the remains of Rollo's descendants, Richard the Fearless and Richard the Good, were unable to give conclusive evidence that linked Rollo to a particular origin. The identification process is made more difficult by the ubiquitous usage of place names during Rollo's era, as well as by the absence of identifiable national borders between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Despite the efforts that have been made to establish his birthplace, the identification process remains complicated. Rollo Einsteinsson would have been one of 6 siblings if he had been confirmed to be Rognvald Einsteinsson's son. His older brothers would have been born outside of wedlock, while his younger brothers would have been born legitimately. Despite the fact that the Norse sagas are difficult as historical sources because of their tendency towards sensationalism, they lend support to the assertion that Rollo was Hrolfur, son of Rognvald Einsteinsson. This assertion is supported by stories from Scotland and Ireland that date back to the same time period. The assertion that Rollo was Hrolfur, son of Rognvald Einsteinsson, is supported by Scottish and Irish records from the time period. However, in the instance of Rollo, these accounts do not support the claim. Rollo, also known as Rollo of Normandy, is believed to have been born sometime in the middle of the 9th century, most likely in the year 860 AD, according to historical chronicles. Rollo will also be known as Rollo of Normandy. After establishing Normandy and becoming its first king, he was a Viking from Scandinavia who eventually built Normandy. In addition to that, he was the founder of Normandy. 2 of the other names that have been used to refer to Rollo in literature are Rolf Ru Roland, French, and Hofer, Old Norse. Both of these names are from the French language. Rognvald Einsteinsson, who is believed to have been the Jarl or Earl of Moera, a county located in the northern part of Norway at the beginning of Western Norway, could have been Rollo's father. This is a hypothesis that has been brought forward. In addition to being known by the names Rognvald the Wise and Rognvald the Powerful, he was a close friend and ally of Harald Fairhair, the first known monarch of Norway. He was also known as Rognvald the Powerful. Rognvald was also referred to by the name Rognvald the Powerful at one point in time. On the other hand, the information that is known concerning Rognvald's life is inconsistent, and the narratives that have been published are frequently twisted and exaggerated. There is a common problem in the sources that involves contradictions in the identification of Rollo's father. This problem has to be addressed. In accordance with certain historical documents, Rollo's father could have been Ketil, and it is possible that Ketil Flatnose was the King of the Isles, which was a Norse monarchy located in the Scottish Isles. King of the Isles, Ketil Flatnose was an important figure in the realm. However, this information is not in agreement with other documents, as there are accusations that Rollo's father was actually Rognvald Einsteinsson. This information is not compatible with other papers. However, the extent to which she played a role in Rollo's life is a matter of controversy, and there is exceedingly little data that is publicly available. It is generally recognized that Rollo's mother was a Scandinavian noblewoman by the name of Hilda Horolfsdottir. However, there is very little evidence that is freely available. There are a number of literary chronicles that make reference to the quarrel that took place between Rollo's family and King Harald Fairhair of Norway. Rollo's father and younger brother were both murdered during this combat, and Rollo was driven into exile when his mother, Hilda, petitioned for her son to be granted amnesty. Rollo's father was also considered a victim of this fight. As a consequence of this, Rollo was bound to depart from the country. Rollo is believed to have fled Norway, or possibly Denmark, and then travelled the North Sea, possibly stopping at Orkney. This is the theory that has been put out. We are under the impression that Rollo has fled into exile. On the other hand, the information that is accessible concerning Rollo's early life is unclear, and there are very few specifics. Authors who wrote about Rollo frequently lived many years after his death, and their stories were frequently crafted to support the Norman dynasty that Rollo formed, rather than to depict events as they actually occurred. Authors who wrote about Rollo frequently lived many years after his death. In their efforts to acquire a more profound understanding of Rollo and the point at which he began, the students of history are presented with a tremendous deal of difficulties and conflict. One of the difficulties that historians face when attempting to comprehend Rollo is the question of where in Scandinavia Rollo originated. This is just one of the many paradoxes that historical researchers face. It is well known that Rollo belonged to the Old Norse faith, which is typically referred to as Norse paganism by its Christian neighbours. This ancient religion system was polytheistic, and its pantheon consisted of a large number of gods and goddesses, the most well-known of which were Odin and Thor. According to mythology, the gods were separated into two groups, the Aesir and the Vanir. As a result of an ancient conflict, the Aesir and the Vanir were able to reconcile their powers and consider themselves equal. The Old Norse religion represented a world that was alive with mythological entities such as dwarfs, giants, elves, and spirits of nature, all of whom inhabited the earth. This was in addition to the gods that were included in the religion. Due to the fact that the Old Norse religion was based on an oral tradition, it was deeply rooted in ceremonial activities. Kings and chiefs played crucial roles in performing public acts of devotion and sacrifices in designated sacred locations such as cult houses, groves, and lakes. However, as time went on, the influence of Christianity gradually replaced the Old Norse religion. By the time Rollo's children were born, the religion had been entirely destroyed, although elements of Scandinavian folklore continued to exist. The period of time known as the Viking Age went from the late 8th century to the late 11th century and was characterized by remarkable levels of exploration, trade, and cultural exchange. This period of time lasted from the late 8th century to the late 11th century. There was a considerable impact that Viking explorers from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden had on the early medieval history of Europe and beyond. This impact was felt throughout the world. Before coming back to their homelands, these explorers travelled to a great distance beyond their borders. These courageous sailors sailed enormous distances, all the way to North America, the Mediterranean Sea, the Black Sea, the Middle East, and North Africa. They also travelled to North Africa. In addition to that, they arrived to the continent of North America. During the remarkable journey that the Vikings undertook, longships that were equipped with cutting-edge technology were an indispensable component. These quick vessels, which were differentiated by their long and narrow shape with symmetrical ends, were capable of both river navigation and open sea exploration. They were able to do both of these things. The construction of Viking longships was accomplished through the use of the clinker boat building technology, which was first developed in Scandinavia. After being developed, these vessels were versatile enough to perform a wide range of functions, which was a significant advantage. Not only did they make it simpler to carry out the operations of raids and campaigns, but they also made it less difficult to engage in activities such as exploration, colonization, and long-distance trade. Throughout Europe and beyond, the Viking expansion had a significant impact on both trade routes and commercial activity. This expansion had a deep influence on both of these aspects of commerce. There was a wide network of trade networks among the Vikings, and they engaged in the exchange of goods with areas that were very far away. Silverware from Byzantium, garnets from India and Sri Lanka, money from the Islamic religion, and even artifacts that were considered to be exotic, such as a gold image of Buddha, were among the prominent products that were exchanged. Archaeological digs have unearthed evidence of Viking economic connections that went as far as Baghdad, an important city of the Islamic Empire and the Silk Road trade network. These connections have been uncovered as a result of the discovery of these connections. Silk originating from China was discovered in graves placed all throughout Scandinavia during the time period of the Vikings. This discovery sheds light on the extensive nature of the Vikings' commercial networks. In addition to being merchants, the Vikings were also considered to be active players in the economic systems that were present throughout the time period in which they lived. Along the Volga River, they transported their own trade products, which included furs, tusks, and slaves that they had taken during raids. They also transported slaves. Mobility and participation in commerce were two aspects that contributed to the cultural and ethnic diversity that existed within the Viking culture over the course of its history. A number of factors, including the mobility of people and the practice of intermarriage, as well as the tendency of the Vikings to take brides from other countries, had an impact on the genetic and historical history of Scandinavia, as well as the areas that the Vikings expanded their territory into. The Vikings' trading ports were the most culturally diverse concentrations of Viking activity, because they were areas where people from a wide variety of backgrounds gathered together. This made the Vikings' trading ports the most culturally diverse. This particular kind of diversity was exemplified by Birka, which is located on an island in Sweden. There were between 500 to 1,000 people living in Birka at the time, making it the oldest town in Sweden during the Viking Age. Birka was a bustling centre of economic activity and had a population that was believed to be between 500 and 1,000 people. The graveyard at this location, which has over 2,000 graves and a significant number of graves that are unmarked, is a reflection of the prominence of this place as a town and a hub for business. The decline of Birka, which took place about the year 975, however, constituted a change in the patterns of residence that were prevalent at the time. There is a new urban centre that has emerged in the form of Sigtuna, which is a Christian town that was constructed approximately 35 kilometres to the northeast of Birka. This development brought to light the constantly shifting dynamics of Viking society, which were influenced by the increasing prevalence of Christianity and the transformation of governmental systems, which in turn brought about changes in patterns of settlement. The settlement of Hedeby, which is situated on the Jutland Peninsula in modern-day Denmark, and the town of Kopan, whose name roughly translates to marketplace, were two other prominent Viking commercial ports. The first market town in Norway was called Kopan, and it was situated in close proximity to the city of Oslo, presently known as Oslo. As a result of their participation in perilous missions, which required them to traverse perilous waters and manage sophisticated trade networks, they left an indelible mark on the regions that they came into contact with. It was their trading outposts, which served as strategic hubs and critical nodes in the vast Viking commercial network, that served as the basis for their dominant position in the maritime realm. It is a tribute to the far-reaching influence that Viking commerce had, that among these locations, Jorvik, which is now known as York, Staraya Ladoga, and Novgorod, stood out as examples. The presence of these areas made it feasible to engage in the exchange of goods over extensive distances, thus establishing a connection between Scandinavia and other nations and civilizations that were situated in other regions of the world. Their legendary longships, which were warships that were renowned for their speed, agility, and adaptability, were one of the most crucial components of the Vikings' domination in the maritime realm. The shallow drafts and sleek designs of these ships made them not only instruments of battle, but also instruments of trade and exploration. They were also instruments of naval exploration. Each of these vessels was responsible for carrying out both of these responsibilities. The evidence in the form of numbers indicates their effectiveness and calls attention to the significant role that these vessels played in Viking raiding operations and commercial trips. Despite the fact that they were notorious for their raids, the Vikings' maritime operations consisted of more than just attacks. The coastal settlements, riverways, and trading ports that were located all throughout Europe were the targets of these expeditions, which were characterized by aspects of surprise and speed. In addition to leaving an indelible impact on the coastlines of Francia and the Rhineland, the Vikings left an indelible impression on the geographical locations that they pillaged. Lindisfarne, which is located in Northumbria, is particularly notable for this. Their conquests reached as far as Spain and the Mediterranean, leaving a trail of terror and ruin in their wake, where they had left their mark. The quantitative evidence gives a startling picture of the magnitude of their expeditions, which went as far as Spain and the Mediterranean. These raids were carried out by the Spanish. The Vikings, on the other hand, were able to access opportunities that had not been open to them in the past because of their reputation as dreadful warriors. During the time that they were serving as diplomats to Byzantium, they were able to secure employment as mercenaries in the Varangian Guard, which was a notable military formation. Legislation was enacted to prohibit the outflow of manpower to countries outside of the United States of America. This was done because of the significant numerical impact that their service had. In the same manner, their position as mercenaries in Kievan Rus and England brought to light their military capability and strategic significance in the process of establishing the geopolitical landscape of Europe. One of the numerous features that are illuminated by numerical data is the fact that Viking activities are seasonal in nature. This is just one of the many different characteristics. Ripping and trading were both activities that occurred in cycles, with excursions being scheduled to coincide with ideal weather conditions each time. This was done in order to maximize the likelihood of success. It was a reflection of the changing seasons that the ebb and flow of Viking expeditions continued to occur. There was a return to the beaches of Scandinavia during the winter months, where communities awaited the return of their relatives who had sailed away. The Vikings, on the other hand, had an influence that extended far beyond the sphere of plain plunder and conquest. The invasion of the enormous heathen army was known as the Viking invasion, according to the histories written within the English language. A peace that was established as a consequence of the invasion of England by Viking armies led to the consolidation of Viking rule over the region, which eventually became known as the Danelaw, with its centre located in Jorvik, which is now known as York. An increase in the number of people living in Scandinavia, in addition to the mixing of the two cultures and languages, resulted in the formation of an Anglo-Norse dialect. This dialect may still be seen in the place names of the northern areas of England in the present day. As a consequence of the increasing number of people living in Scandinavia, these Viking warriors were showing a growing interest in transferring to the British Isles, which were situated in close proximity to their homeland. In the past, they had been interested in gaining fame and riches on these islands. However, they now intended to engage in activities that were less disruptive, such as farming, and to make their permanent residence on these islands. Viking navigators, who were known for their prowess as sailors, travelled far from their homelands in Scandinavia and established prosperous trading hubs and towns in a variety of places. Viking exploration resulted in a number of significant effects, one of which was the discovery and brief settlement of North America. The Vikings were the first Europeans to arrive on the continent, which occurred about the year 1000. Additionally, during this time period, Viking colonies were established along important waterways in Eastern Europe. These colonies played a significant role in the establishment of great dynasties, such as the Rurik dynasty in Kievan Rus. The multi-purpose longships that the Vikings used had a significant impact on the success of their trips, as they made it possible for them to engage in both raiding and commercial activities. It was possible for Vikings to surprise their targets and avoid potential defences thanks to the shallow draft, manoeuvrability, and lightweight design of these vessels. This made them suitable for crossing both coastal waterways and inland rivers. Their raids were not confined to affluent monasteries. Rather, they stretched to coastal towns and inland areas spanning Ireland, England, Scotland, France, and other countries as well. There is evidence to imply that Viking raiding routes extended as far as Spain, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. These routes targeted cities such as Rouen and wealthy monasteries along the Seine River. In spite of the fact that they were known for their fierce fighting abilities, the Vikings were also involved in commerce and exploration. They established commercial networks that were successful and extended beyond Europe. When the Vikings established connections with Byzantium and the Islamic world, they were able to acquire expensive items such as silverware, garnet, silk, and even a gold Buddha figure. These items eventually made their way into the tombs of Vikings in Scandinavia and Britain. The engagement of the Vikings in trade went all the way to the Volga River, where they participated in the exchange of furs, tusks, and slaves for products from the East. It was common practice to sell unusual commodities, foreign coinage, and cultural influences from all over the world at the bustling trading ports of Birka, Hedeby, and Kopan. These ports acted as transportation centres. Not only did the Viking Age have a significant impact on the economic landscape of Europe, but it also left an indelible mark on the political and social systems of the continent. Settlements established by Vikings resulted in the formation of new communities and cultural identities, which in turn had an impact on subsequent groups such as the Normans, Norse Gaels, and the Rus people. The descendants of Viking settlers played a significant part in the formation of the reigning dynasties of a number of European countries, including the royal families of Russia and Great Britain. Additionally, the progressive consolidation of Norse homelands and the development of distinct nation-states such as Norway, Denmark and Sweden occurred concurrently with the Christianization of Europe. These events took place during the same time period. During the period when Rollo was alive, the political landscape of Europe was marked by multiple kingdoms that were in conflict with one another and power conflicts. The collapse of Carolingian authority in West Francia set the ground for the establishment of powerful vassals and subsequent internal wars within the Carolingian Empire. Francia became an important hub for Christianization activities, which influenced the conversion of Viking lands and fostered cultural interchange between Scandinavia and the Christian world. Francia was involved in the conversion of Viking areas. Additionally, the Vikings continued to play a key role as mercenaries, serving in the Varangian Guard and other military formations across Europe. This was the case notwithstanding the difficulties that were brought about by the lack of royal authority. The period of time between the late 8th and early 11th centuries was marked by a series of persistent Viking assaults and confrontations between the West Franks and the Norsemen, which ultimately resulted in the formation of Normandy in the year 911. Around the year 820, Viking assaults began in West France, particularly in the region of the Seine Valley. These raids persisted until the year 911, when peace was mediated between Rollo and King Charles the Simple. The first known encounter with a Viking fleet took place in 841, when a Viking fleet sailed up the Seine and conquered and burned the city of Rouen. The earliest Viking raids that have been documented along the Seine in northern France date back to roughly the year 800. The subsequent raids resulted in the pillaging of wealthy monasteries such as Jumièges and Fontenelle, as well as the siege of Paris in the year 845, during which Vikings commanded by chieftain Reginurus compelled King Charles the Bald to pay a substantial ransom. Despite the fact that initial payments were made to discourage Viking raids, the attacks continued. Notable raids took place in the years 851 and 853, and renowned Viking leaders such as Asgeir and Sigtryg were responsible for them. By the year 858, the profits from Viking raids had reached such a high level that well-known leaders like Bjorn Ironside and Haystein began conducting raids in France, in addition to their adventures in the Mediterranean. In the year 859, there was a considerable increase in the amount of Viking activity. This was due to the fact that internal problems within West Francia produced an opportunity for Viking raids. In order to take advantage of the power struggle that was taking place between King Charles the Bald and his half-brother Louis, Viking chiefs launched attacks on Bayeux, Lyon, and Beauvais. They also executed bishops and pillaged monasteries. King Charles the Bald took defensive preparations in reaction to the increasing number of Viking assaults. These actions included the construction of fortified bridges across the Seine and Loire rivers in order to secure Paris and the Frankish heartland. In addition, he utilized Viking chieftains such as Velund in order to fight against the Seine Vikings, although he was only partially successful. Additional Viking assaults took place throughout the summer of 860, with chieftains such as Haystein and Bjorn Ironside wreaking havoc as far as Italy, plundering cities such as Pisa and Fissel in the region of Tuscany. During this time, Wieland's Viking invaders moved their attention to England and launched an assault on Winchester, which was ultimately repulsed by West Saxon forces. In spite of the fact that military action and diplomatic measures were made to put an end to Viking attacks, the raids continued. As a result, King Charles the Bald recruited local rulers, such as Robert the Strong of Neustria, to fight against Viking commanders such as Valand. On the other hand, a permanent Viking settlement in France did not come into existence until Rollo established Normandy, This was the first time that the Vikings settled in France. During Rollo's lifetime, West Francia continued to engage in this cycle of military confrontation, tribute payment, and baptism in order to maintain control over Viking raids and to protect its lands from additional assaults. Between the late 8th and early 11th centuries, there was a period of time that was characterized by a series of repeated Viking invasions and clashes between the West Franks and the Norsemen. These conflicts finally led to the foundation of Normandy in the year 911. The beginning of Viking attacks in West France can be traced back to the year 820, namely in the vicinity of the Seine Valley. There was a continuation of these raids until the year 911, when Rollo and King Charles the Simple reached a peace agreement through mediation. The city of Rouen was conquered and torched by a Viking fleet in the year 841, which is considered to be the earliest known encounter with a Viking fleet. The Viking fleet sailed up the Seine River. Around the year 800, the earliest Viking raids that have been reported along the Seine in northern France date back to the time period. As a consequence of the succeeding attacks, wealthy monasteries such as Jumièges and Fontenelle were pillaged. Additionally, the siege of Paris in the year 845 was carried out by Vikings under the direction of chieftain Reganurus. During this siege, King Charles the Bald was forced to pay a hefty ransom. In spite of the fact that initial payments were made in an effort to deter Viking assaults, the attacks continued. There were notable raids that took place between the years 851 and 853, and well-known Viking leaders like Asgeir and Sigtryg were the ones responsible for them. Since the earnings from Viking raids had reached such a high level by the year 858, well-known captains like as Bjorn Ironside and Haystein began conducting raids in France, in addition to their adventures in the Mediterranean. This was because the revenues from Viking raids had reached such a high level. Beginning in the year 859, there was a significant rise in the quantity of activities that was carried out by Vikings. This occurred as a result of the fact that West Francia's internal conflicts created an opening for Viking invasions to take place. In order to capitalize on the power struggle that was taking place between King Charles the Bald and his half-brother Louis, Viking chiefs conducted attacks on Bayeux, Laon, and Beauvais. These attacks were carried out in order to take advantage of the situation. Monasteries were also pillaged, and bishops were put to death by them. At Enquier, as the number of Viking raids continued to rise, King Charles the Bald made defensive preparations in response to the situation. For the purpose of securing Paris and the Frankish heartland, these measures included the construction of fortified bridges that crossed the Seine and the Loire rivers. Furthermore, in order to combat the Seine Vikings, he made use of Viking chieftains such as Veland, despite the fact that he was only partially successful in his endeavours. Additional Viking raids took place throughout the summer of 860, with chieftains such as Haystein and Bjorn Ironside spreading havoc as far as Italy, looting cities such as Pisa and Fiesole in the province of Tuscany. These chieftains were responsible for the destruction of their territory. In the course of this time period, the Viking invaders from Wieland shifted their focus to England and launched an assault on Winchester. However, the West Saxon soldiers were ultimately successful in repelling the onslaught. The raids continued even after military action, and diplomatic steps were taken to put a halt to Viking incursions. Despite these precautions, the Vikings continued to strike. The consequence of this was that King Charles the Bald enlisted the assistance of local rulers, such as Robert the Strong of Neustria, in order to engage in combat with Viking commanders like Valand. In contrast, the establishment of Normandy by Rollo was the first step towards the establishment of a permanent Viking settlement in France. The Vikings established their first permanent settlement in France during this time. Throughout Rollo's lifetime, West Francia continued to engage in this cycle of military confrontation, tribute payment, and baptism in order to keep control over Viking attacks and to safeguard its lands from subsequent assaults. This was done while Rollo was alive. It was Rollo's audacious acquisition of territories along the River Epte and the independent Duchy of Brittany that propelled him to the forefront of famous people. Rollo's journey to fame began with this accomplishment, which marked the beginning of those years. These triumphs, which established his control over vast swathes of land and set the ground for his later clashes with Charles the Simple, the King of the Franks, were the catalysts that made his later encounters with Charles the Simple possible. Rollo and Charles formed a deal that not only involved the exchange of land for peace, but also served as a symbolic representation of their loyalty to one another and their willingness to yield to one another. Rollo, on the other hand, was a fiery individualist who refused to submit to authority, as seen by his refusal to humble himself in front of the king. This was a clear display of Rollo's unwillingness to submit to authority. This act of disobedience was documented by chroniclers such as Dudo of St. Quentin, who described a situation that was both humorous and profound with the purpose of showcasing Rollo's determination to chart his own course. Rollo's conversion to Christianity, which played a prominent role in the pact, was an essential component of Frankish diplomacy that aimed to include Viking leaders into the Christian fold. There was a strong desire to bring them into the fold of Christianity. Rollo's baptism in 912 was celebrated as a victory for Christianity and served as a symbol of the spread of Christian ideas into nations that had previously been governed by pagan religions. Rollo's baptism was a significant event when it occurred. According to the accounts of Christian chroniclers, Rollo's conversion was a pivotal moment in the process of Christianization that took place in the northern states. The reason for this was to highlight the transformative power of faith, as well as the triumph of Christian traits over thoughts that are associated with pagan beliefs. The relationship that Rollo has with his wife continues to be shrouded in mystery and intrigue, despite the fact that this is the case. There have been a number of various versions presented concerning his wives, notably with regard to Gisela, who is supposed to be the daughter of King Charles. Each of these accounts has its own unique perspective. While there are chroniclers who certify to Rollo's marriage to Gisela, there are still problems that remain because there are no historical documents, and there are contradictions on the tale. Despite the fact that there are chroniclers who attest to the marriage, there are still questions that remain. The existence of Gisela and her purported marriage to Rollo are both called into question as a consequence of the legitimacy of Rollo's son, William Longsword, which further complicates the matter. Gisela's existence is also brought into question. Due to the intricate nature of medieval politics and alliances, historians face a challenge when attempting to discriminate between historical reality and literary embellishment. The task of extracting the truth from the intricate web of myth and legend presents a problem for historians who are seeking to do so. With the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte, not only was it the culmination of Rollo's rise to power, but it also marked the continuation of Frankish defence strategies against Viking raids. These strategies were symbolised by the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte. A realistic approach was taken by King Charles, with the intention of reducing the level of aggressiveness displayed by Vikings and safeguarding Frankish territories through diplomatic activities. This logical strategy was chosen by King Charles once he realised that it was pointless to engage in ongoing conflict, As a means of preserving stability and shielding his kingdom from any further assaults, Charles established Normandy as a vassal state. His goal was to defend his kingdom from any further advances. The signing of the pact by Rollo marked the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Franco-Norse ties. This new chapter was defined by mutual respect and diplomatic involvement between the two countries. On the basis of his own experiences, as well as those of his ancestors, Charles the Simple was aware, over the course of several generations, that attempting to push back against the Viking invaders was a fruitless method. This realization was based on the fact that he had experienced both of these things. West Francia's response to Viking assaults had been mostly reactive in the previous century, relying on measures such as paying off raiders with Danegeld. This was the case throughout the previous era. In light of the fact that Charles the Simple saw that there was no point in engaging in direct confrontation, he embraced appeasement as the best practical strategy for protecting his kingdom. The Treaty of 911 with Rollo, on the other hand, marked a departure from these reactionary measures and a move toward a solution that was more proactive and lasting. Rollo's commitment to the conditions of the contract and his determination to fulfill his commitments as a vassal of the Frankish monarch were the distinguishing characteristics that set him apart from other Viking kings in preceding times. Rollo had a genuine dedication to preserving Normandy and ensuring that Viking attacks in the region came to an end. This was in contrast to the ephemeral raiders of the past who pillaged and then fled the region. It was because of this newly discovered stability that he was able to concentrate on governance and the implementation of comprehensive reforms. An approach that was multidimensional and aimed at restoration, reformation, and the establishment of law and order was one of the defining characteristics of Rollo's governance in Normandy during his reign. He placed a high priority on the restoration of churches, the reconstruction of city walls, and the fortification of vital areas because he understood the significance of rebuilding after years of conflict and instability. A physical repair of the region was not the only thing that these efforts represented. They also served as a demonstration of Rollo's dedication to maintaining peace and stability in the region. The implementation of a thorough legal system, which took its cues from the legal traditions of Scandinavia, was an essential component of Rollo's government. By replacing passive laws that just advised appropriate actions with legislation that could be enforced, his legal code placed an emphasis on human responsibility, honour, and accountability. During Rollo's reign, the severity of punishments for crimes such as theft, murder, assault, and fraud increased. This was a reflection of Rollo's unflinching dedication to preserving the order of society and discouraging criminal activity. An tale that involves a farmer's wife attempting to commit fraud is a good illustration of the legal reforms that Rollo implemented. It was stated that a farmer's wife attempted to take advantage of a change in the law that required farm tools to be left in the field overnight by concealing them and alleging that they had been stolen. This narrative demonstrates how effective Rollo's legal reforms are in maintaining the integrity of society and sustaining the rule of law. Rollo's severe enforcement of the law and rapid administration of justice are two examples that illustrate this efficacy. The guy was reimbursed by Rollo for the loss of his tools, and Rollo asked that the men who were suspected of taking the tools be put on trial through the use of torture. After it was shown that no one was guilty for the crime, the wife was subjected to physical abuse until she acknowledged being the one who had committed the fraud. Due to the fact that her husband admitted that he had been aware of the lie from the very beginning, it was determined that both she and her husband were responsible for the crime. He died by hanging. The occurrence, which was believed to have shocked the local population to such an extent, is said to have resulted in Normandy being a territory that was free from petty criminal activity for the coming century. This is stated to have occurred as a consequence of these events. Furthermore, heavy punishments were handed out to anyone who sought to engage in the activity. Rollo's reputation, as well as the reputation of his wife, suffered as a result of his actions, which damaged their reputation. The punishment for such a crime was to put the person who committed the crime to death in the public plaza of Rouen during the execution. Instances have occurred in which individuals who work in the judicial system have been forced to squander their time due to the presence of phony witnesses or any other situation. Saw a considerable reduction in comparison. These examples of Viking justice appeared to be brutal to the Christian bishops of the region, who were concerned about the situation. On the other hand, there was a notion that Rollo's conversion, along with the conversion of every other pagan person, was a process that would take a considerable amount of time to complete. During a particular time period, it was to be anticipated that there would be a combination of Christian and Viking customs and culture, as well as viewpoints on law and order and morality. This was to be expected. Putting it another way, there is no bishop who could argument against Rollo's track record of success in Normandy and refute it with your own arguments. Both the prosperity that he had brought to the region and the fact that he had taken care to maintain law and order were indisputable. Rollo's dominion over Normandy was a prosperous one. Over the course of his life, Rollo was known by a number of different titles, one of which was Chieftain Rollo, but his favourite appellation is still unclear. His rule was marked by a complicated combination of loyalty, geographical expansion, and political manipulation. His reign was characterised by these three factors. The commencement of Rollo's personal and political development may be traced back to the initial agreement he made with King Charles the Simple of West Francia. He made a solemn oath of allegiance to Charles, and in exchange, he was given territory in the region that would emerge as Normandy in the future. Together, Rollo's efforts to curb Viking incursions and his dedication to upholding law and order in his realms were two of the factors that contributed to his success as a monarch. However, in 922, when Charles was ousted and Robert the Frey ascended to the throne, his loyalties went in a different direction. Rollo continued his raiding activities in order to expand his realm to the west, despite his refusal to acknowledge Robert's authority. The purpose of this strategic maneuver was to exert pressure on other monarchs, so that they would negotiate on his terms. Rollo's influence in the region was further strengthened as a result of the subsequent discussions, which led to the transfer of more provinces, notably Bessin and Maine. The formal titles of Duke or Count were never bestowed to Rollo during his lifetime, despite the fact that he was able to effectively rule and expand geographical territory. In its place, these titles were given to his successors, such as his great-grandson Richard II, who achieved the distinction of becoming the first Duke of Normandy to be officially recognised. The year 927 marked the Ratois Esistetkirs and attended the end of an era when Rollo retired from his position as ruler of Normandy. Nevertheless, his legacy continued to live on via his successors. Rollo's policies of prosperity, order, and peace were maintained by the subsequent rulers of Normandy, including William Longsword, Richard the Fearless, and Richard II. Under the leadership of Rollo and his successors, Normandy underwent a remarkable transition over the course of time, transforming from a backwater that had been neglected into a formidable duchy. The hierarchy and the system of law and order in Normandy grew in conjunction with advances in France as a whole. Yet they nonetheless managed to maintain their own unique identity. It was initially based on ancient customary law, which was a combination of Scandinavian legal concepts introduced by the Vikings and Frankish legal traditions that were dominant in France. Over the course of time, Normandy's legal system changed. The merger of Frankish and Viking influences is demonstrated by the fact that this customary law was eventually recorded in Latin. William the Conqueror, Rollo's great-great-great-grandson, was the one who spearheaded the rewriting of Normandy's law code at the beginning of the 13th century. He was responsible for establishing the legal framework of Normandy into the second Grand Coutumier de Normandie. A comprehensive legal system that incorporated royal legislation, Roman law, medieval Frankish law, and canon law was established as a result of this reorganization, which signified the transition from ancient customary law to the Roman legal system. The Coutume de Normandie, which is the customary law of Normandy, continued to be in effect in the Channel Islands until the French Revolution. However, it was not employed in France with the introduction of Napoleon's civil code in the year 1804. When Rollo's ancestors were in charge of the Society of Normandy, feudalism was a crucial factor in the formation of that society. Following the Norman conquest, Normandy formed a regulated social and political hierarchy by adopting the feudal system, which was similar to the system that was used in the rest of France and England until that point. A manorial system was established in which peasants were forced to work on the land. The upper classes were responsible for the defense of the nation, and the monarch ruled under the obligations of feudalism. Peasants were chained to the land through the practice of serfdom, while land ownership became the privilege of the upper classes. In exchange for the land, the Duke of Normandy paid homage to the King of France as a vassal. This allowed Normandy to keep its independence and distinctive cultural character within the context of the larger framework of medieval France. Rollo's ancestors were responsible for the progressive processes of cultural integration and identity construction that occurred in Normandy. A number of individuals, including William Longsword and Richard the Fearless, were the pioneers in the process of assimilating Norman elites into the culture of French Catholicism, while also keeping aspects of their Viking background. As a result of their ability to communicate in French with one another, the Normans of Normandy developed into a culture that was multilingual. They communicated in a variety of languages with their foreign relatives and allies. The Norman French language, which is a combination of the Norse and Gallo-Frankish languages, became the linguistic signature of Normandy. This was a reflection of the coming together of the Frankish and Viking cultures. The growth of Normandy and the establishment of diplomatic contacts expanded beyond the bounds of Normandy. Norman nobles sought alliances and married into royal families from other countries. The daughters of Rollo established marriage partnerships with influential foreign elites, which resulted in the growth of Normandy's diplomatic ties throughout Europe. After a period of time, Rollo's descendants came to the thrones of England, Ireland, Sicily, and Antioch, making an indelible mark on the histories of these territories and contributing to the heritage of the Normans. The conquest of England by William the Conqueror in the year 1066 is considered to be a defining point in the history of the Normans. The monarchy and government of England were both reformed as a result of William's claim to the English throne, which was founded on familial ties and military strength. William defeated Harold Godwinson and established Norman dominance in England by employing strategic fortifications, coastal pillaging, and tactical brilliance. This victory allowed William to establish Norman rule in England. Following his ascendancy to the throne of England, William went on to put the experiences and knowledge that he had received from his Norman heritage to use in his reign. He continued the family tradition of marrying relatives of his opponents in order to win their allegiance. And he coordinated with a considerable number of the people who were already serving as bishops. He was successful in gaining their support. Furthermore, he was responsible for the construction of massive castles and fortifications, both of which were widely used in his own country of France, including either the White Tower or the Tower of London in the list of properties. William's castles were everywhere in England, even as far north as York, and they served as a reminder of the Norman power and permanence that prevailed during that time period. William's castles were placed all across the country. The construction of William's Castle brought about a revolution in the environment, but the Norman reign in England also left an indelible stamp on English law, the ownership of land, and the organisational framework of the government. William's Castle was the catalyst for this transformation. For the purpose of compiling the Domesday Book, which was written by William the Conqueror, a survey of land ownership was carried out. The survey revealed that the church controlled 26% of the land, while the Normans possessed almost all of the property. A classic example of Anglo-Saxon. Over the course of time, those who were privileged were gradually replaced, and the locals only possessed around 5% of the land. Both the administration and the judiciary were now operating in French as their official language of communication. In the same way as it happened in Normandy, the feudal system was formalized throughout this time period. As time went on, the social classes became stiffer. Magnates who had been given titles and lands by the monarch were invited to take part in royal councils prior to the establishment of the House of Lords. These councils functioned as the predecessor of the House of Lords. Local landowners who do not possess titles to their properties remains responsible for the management of the community's affairs. In addition, there is evidence that the Normans left their mark on the history of the royal family in England. In the course of a civil war that lasted from 1141 until 1148, Matilda, who was the granddaughter of William the Conqueror, governed for a brief amount of time after the conflict began. It was in the year 1172 that her son Henry Plantagenet became King Henry II and ascended to the throne himself. Due to the fact that the current members of the British royal family are direct descendants of the House of Plantagenet, the House of Plantagenet has been inherited by the current members of the royal family. More specifically, Normandy. For the invasion of Sicily that took place in the year 1091, the Hauteville line, which was another line of the House of Normandy, was the one that was responsible. The Vikings had been present in the region of Italy for a considerable amount of time and had been active there. With the year 860 having passed, there have been, it is said that Vikings from Francia travelled to Iberia and what is now Italy. These narratives have been found in many historical sources. The River Arno was utilised by the Vikings in order to take control of the port city of Luni, which is situated in the northwest region of Italy, as stated by the chronicler Dudo. Not only pizza, but also Fissol. There is a high probability that Viking mercenaries serving for Byzantium, the Varangians, and Viking traders would have travelled through the territory of Italy on multiple occasions. A location to the north of Florence would have been appropriate for these individuals. The Arab Muslims were successful in seizing control of Sicily from the Romans in the year 965. The Byzantine Empire, as well as succession, crises, and rivalry among provincial rulers, produced a hole that the Normans were able to fill at the beginning of the 11th century. The Normans were able to fill this void It was during the time that Norman Robert Guiscard was still the Duke of Apulia that, along with his brother Roger Bosso, Robert Bosso was given the title of Duke of Sicily by the Pope. The Pope wanted them to seize control of the island and return it to its Christian state, so he gave them the title. Moreover, the title was bestowed upon Calabria. In the month of May in the year 1061, the Norman brothers began their invasion and was responsible for the construction of the first Norman castle in Sicily, which was known as San Marco dell'Onzio and was situated in Messina. In order to continue acquiring information from the areas and civilizations that they had conquered, the Normans in southern Italy combined Lombard, which was a type of grape. There is a blend of architectural techniques from northern Italy, Byzantine architecture, and Islamic architecture that may be found in the defences of the Kingdom of Sicily. This architecture is known as Norman Arab architecture. Following the continuation of the attack on the island for a further 10 years, a siege was placed on Sicily. On Palermo, the Normans were victorious in their attempt to take control of the city. In the year 1071, on the 10th of January, Robert, Duke of Sicily, bestowed upon his brother the title of Count of Sicily and partitioned the island with the goal of selecting Roger as the receiver of his peace by capturing it. This occurred within the context of the partitioning of the island. Those Arabs who were still alive owned landholdings. It was not until February of 1091 that Roger was finally able to complete his conquest of Sicily and gain possession of the entire island. Afterwards, he proceeded to seize possession of the island belonging to Malta. Latin American Christianity eventually made its way back to the island of Sicily and Palermo, where it was first practiced. It eventually became the capital of the nation. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry III the Sixth is said to have invaded Sicily in 1194 on behalf of his wife, Constance, who was the daughter of Roger. This story is based on historical evidence. It was as a consequence of this invasion that the Kingdom of Sicily was brought down. On the other hand, the impact of Norms. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who was partly Norman, was anointed King Frederick II of Sicily in 1198. He went on to become Holy Roman Emperor in 1212, further consolidating the Holy Roman Empire's position as the dominant power in the world. 1194 was not the year that brought an end to the conflict that had been going on in Sicily over the years. The House of Normandy is considered to be a significant distance away. Approximately in the year 1098, the Principality of Antioch was established. This principality is situated in close proximity to what is now Antakya and Turkey. This took place around the same time when Sicily was taken over by the Italians. In the course of this time period, the United States beginning in 1096 and continuing until 1099, the Holy Land was the site of a religious conflict known as the Crusade. During this fight, a significant number of Normans served. When they arrived in Antioch, the bulk of the Crusaders who settled there were of the Orthodox Christian faith. You are currently in the Kingdom of Sicily. From that moment forward, Bohemond of Taranto, who was the son of Robert, Duke of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily, led a siege of Antioch beginning in the month of October in the year 1097. This siege lasted until the end of the year. As the winter battle of attrition progressed, there were tales told of the tremendous amount of suffering that occurred. Tales were circulated about crusaders who, in order to ensure their own survival, were forced to swallow the remains of those who had been killed in battle. Although Bohemond was a notable Norman ruler in Antioch, he was confronted with a number of problems that put the stability of his reign to the test. The Norman line of rulership in Antioch endured, displaying their capacity to persevere in the face of hardship, despite experiencing a number of losses, including being captured in combat and losing land to the presence of the Byzantine Empire. The Normans continued to dominate Antioch through several generations, including Bohemon's nephew Tancred and Bermond II, who was Tancred's son. Despite the altering geopolitical dynamics, Antioch continued to be governed by successive generations of Norman monarchs, including becoming a vassal state of the Mongol Empire by the year 1260. In the meantime, in France, the successors of Rollo, the originator of the Norman dynasty, handled the complex political terrain with a great deal of dexterity. In order to solidify their authority, the Normans took advantage of the internal tensions that were occurring among the Frankish elite. They did this by employing a combination of conventional Viking techniques, military might, and diplomatic subtlety. Their support for the Capetian dynasty, which was demonstrated by their assistance in King Hugh Capet's ascent to the throne in the year 987, helped to solidify their position and influence throughout the French kingdom. A number of Norman rulers, including Richard I and Richard II of Normandy, established alliances with the French kings. These agreements included the provision of military aid and the promotion of marriage relationships with the French royal family and the nobility in the surrounding areas. The Normans were able to significantly improve their stature in French society and strengthen their political relations through the use of these strategic marriages. There was a common practice among the bourgeois, the Dukes of Normandy, to marry their daughters and sisters into the French royal family, as well as to noblemen from neighbouring regions. The method that Rollo employed, which consisted of agreeing to be ruled by the Frankish king, became more challenging for his direct descendants. Even though they swore allegiance to the Frankish king, the Dukes of Normandy actually exercised their authority over their area in their own unique manner, just like Rollo had done. On the other hand, after the year 1066, the house began to, notwithstanding the fact that it was situated in a different nation, the transition of Normandy from duke to king made it more difficult to establish a relationship with the French crown. Given that King William and his descendants were no longer obligated to loyalty to the King of France, the House of Normandy became increasingly strong under William's successors. They went on to dominate not just England, Ireland and Normandy, but also the Channel Islands, Gascony and Aquitaine. This was before they were able to rule over all of these territories. The descendants of Rollo remained to dominate Normandy until 1204, when John Lackland lost the duchy to Philip Augustus, the King of France. These descendants continued to rule until that year. The title of Duke of Normandy was thereafter bestowed upon the monarchs of the Capetian state, as well as lavished upon their own family members. The administration of the duchy was taken over by the House of Normandy, and the great fortification Château de Rouen was constructed to ensure conformity with the law. This occurred because the monarch could no longer trust the family of Normandy. The province was temporarily brought back under the power of Rollo's direct family as a result of an attempt to retake Normandy by King Henry V, who was a descendant of John Lackland. On the other hand, the territory was lost once more during his dictatorship. It was King Henry VI's son. There was a continuation of the practice of Norman law in Normandy, particularly when the barons and cities of Normandy coerced the King of France into signing the Norman Charter in the year 1315. Or it had the purpose of reducing the intrusion of royal power, limited the power of the king to create taxes in that region, and made the decisions of Normandy's main court final throughout the entire region. Despite the fact that the charter was violated on multiple occasions by the French. the monarchy became more strong, and Rollo himself would not have been able to foresee the long life that Normandy would spend under the authority of his direct dynasty. This is because the Vikings were more frequently transient settlers. However, here's as the Normans continued to exert their authority over Normandy and extend their influence into England, the role that they played in the establishment of the duchy grew increasingly significant. Early chroniclers, such as Dudot of Saint Quentin and William of Jumièges, were eager to document the events that occurred. Imply that Rollo was the single creator of the great Norman monarchy that began in the Middle Ages. The Dudot of Saint Quentin was a Frenchman who established a cordial working relationship with the newly founded rulers of Normandy, and went on to become their historian. Detailed the lives of Norman leaders in a level of detail that had hitherto been reserved for only bishops and abbots. This level of detail had been not available before. The purpose of his writing, which he did between the years 995 and 1015, was to celebrate Rollo was one of the early pioneers of the Norman movement. His work was then expanded upon by the Norman monk William of Jumièges, who wrote after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, with an even greater resolve to honour the Norman dukes. His work was a significant contribution to the Normans. It was Dudot and William of Jumièges who were responsible for shaping the history of the Normans. They frequently focused on the Normans' transition from being pagan Viking raiders to Christian conquerors and leaders. Rollo's narrative, which Dudot had almost entirely dominated. Although Rollo eventually arose, Normandy was largely displaced by William of Jumièges, who included the roles of other major Vikings, such as Bjorn Ironside and the Danes in general. However, Rollo ultimately emerged as the dominant figure, to serve as the primary protagonist in the narrative of the dynasty. The works of Dudot and William of Jumièges have nearly always been relied on by subsequent writers, which has helped to establish their perspectives and interpretations into the annals of history. As with a huge number of the legend that developed around him cast a shadow over the actual rollout that took place involving the Vikings. In the same way that Rollo has emerged as a fiction rather than a real person, the Vikings themselves have been misremembered. The achievements of the Vikings in terms of culture, trade, and exploration are nearly generally overlooked in modern conceptions of the Vikings, which almost invariably centre on their military prowess and barbarism more than anything else. Ideas that are widely held regarding the Vikings: the poetic language of Old Norse, the runic inscriptions, the complexities of the Old Norse religion, and the writings of renowned Viking poets and historians are all ignored. It was the Vikings who had their own unique story, ethics, and ideas about what constitutes morality, as well as its own particular art and architecture. Unlike what is commonly portrayed in current times, the majority of Vikings were not vicious raiders, but rather farmers, fishermen, artisans, and traders. Those who are culturally advanced and in favour of the picture of barbaric Viking warriors wearing horned helmets, which the Vikings never wore. The mixed Viking culture that has been presented to us by archaeology and historical sources has been flattened down. As far as the ancient Norse religion is concerned, interpretations have either concentrated on the violent parts of the religion, such as the wars that took place between the gods, or on the replacement of paganism with Christianity. In particular, the 18th and 19th centuries witnessed the emergence of a more idealized portrayal of the Vikings, in which they were portrayed as upstanding barbarians who were saved by their conversion to Christianity. On this day, the only important periods in Viking history that are frequently depicted and remembered are those that include raiding and conquest. In general, The events that occurred during the Norman conquest of 1066 are taught in British schools. These events include the savagery of Norman forces. There is an emphasis placed on William the Conqueror. On the other hand, just as the chroniclers who concentrated almost solely on Rollo's dealings with Charles, the ordinary things that occurred in Rollo's earlier life are not included. On the subject of Rollo's parentage, the arguments. The questions of where Rollo was born and how he spent his childhood are probably not ones that need to be answered in order for us to comprehend his legacy. The legends and legends that have been passed down through the generations about Rollo, which obfuscate him as a person to some degree, may have